Episode 109, The Power of Language, Why Media Training is So Important Today.
Welcome to the PR Playbook Podcast, the only podcast giving you actionable skills and advice you need to execute a strategic PR program. Warning: what you hear next may lead to brand awareness and increased sales and customer exposure. Now here's your host, Rinjini Joshua.
Hello and welcome to episode 109. Yeah, I can't believe we're this far, but there we are, and it's almost the end of the year. And today's topic is going to be the power of language and why media training is so important. And I was having a conversation with my family this weekend about, current events, Kanye West, Kyrie Irving, people that are being flamed on Twitter, things like that. And we've really seen the media laser focus in on these people. And one of the questions my husband had for me was like, you know, why don't these people have a spokesperson for them? And that's a really good point and good question because there's some people that just shouldn't be in front of the press. But moreover, it's very hard when you're a public figure to just hide behind someone else. So this is actually a very key component in speaker training and media training when it comes to executives of any kind of company. As you've probably noticed, the Tesla CEO, Elon Musk, and former Uber CEO, Travis Kalanick, like what you say in the public affects every fiber of not just your business, but your life. So your life is impacted, your relationships are impacted. I mean, we've seen this time and time again with any kind of CEO, not just in tech, not just in entertainment, and not just in sports, that whatever they say kind of comes back to haunt them. And so the bigger waves you want to make in the world, the more important it is to create focused messages around what you want to talk about and what you want to go to bat for, what you want to champion. It is never a wrong decision to say no comment to journalists or anyone for that matter. My party line for most people when it comes to media relations is even when you're friends with a journalist or even if you're not recording, you're never off the record. And so that's something to remember is that whatever you say to a journalist is never off the record. And today I just wanted to kind of talk about some best practices. Number one, if you are a CEO, C-level, executive level of a company, get some speaker training. I don't know if you know, back in the day, there was Toastmasters, and a lot of people kind of invested in those kinds of programs. I'm sure they still have Toastmasters today. But if you do have a PR agency or you're looking to get into PR or do media relations in any kind of way, you definitely should invest in either having your PR agency execute some media training, which I think is very important, or find a program like a Toastmasters to get some media training or speaker training. And what they typically do, I'm just going to give you an overview of what that usually looks like. They'll have a little agenda for you. They'll probably interview you. We kind of go through the way we do it at the Silver Telegram is that we go through dry runs of interviews. We come up with the questions, and typically some of the harder questions, some of the softball questions that you might have to answer, and just to see how you navigate around those questions. And that's recorded typically on video, or I guess these days you could do it on Zoom. We used to do it with like a recording device, a camcorder, something like some type of recording device. I just said camcorder. Um, so we record you. We'll review the video. We'll highlight points where you might seem a little weak, where you're unsure. And before those interviews, we would prepare you the same way as we would prepare you for a regular interview. Send you key messages and talking points, see how well you've prepared on your own, and then go back and say, okay, these are the areas where you need to improve. You need eye contact here. You need to have stronger intonation in your voice. You need to be more assured of these talking points. You can't say and so much, things like that. So I think it's really important for anyone who's going to be a speaker, spokesperson, speaking on a stage, in a webinar, on a podcast, to get some speaker training. And the more you do it, obviously, the more comfortable you're going to be with it. At the very beginning, if you haven't done a lot of broadcast interviews or anything like that, it's extremely important to make sure that you get speaker training. And so 3 ways, actually, this is 4 ways to stay aligned when you're speaking in front of the public. This is what I wanted to kind of talk about today. So, number one, prepare your key messages of any conversation. Know what you're getting into and then prepare those key messages. If you have an interview set up, you should know what the topic is, where it's kind of going. Sometimes you can even ask, if it's a media interview, you can ask them for the questions in advance. So prepare as much as you can, your key messages, what you're going to say. And in this kind of in the same vein, make sure that you know how far you'll take it as well. So, how far are you going to take the conversation? Where are your limits? You should understand all these things when you're preparing your messaging. So, know what you want to hit off on. I usually tell people, like, what are the 3 takeaways you want people to have from this conversation? How are you providing value to the interviewer, whether it's media or podcast? And also, like, how far are you willing to take it? Because sometimes they might ask you questions out of left field that just kind of come up during the conversation. So what are you willing to comment on? What are you going to say no comment on? In most cases, in my experience, and obviously in our background with startups, we usually end at some kind of funding conversation. And that's usually where we draw a line, whether it's, you know, are you being funded now? How much are you raising? Who are your investors? So a lot of times we have to kind of draw the line and say no comment to some of that stuff, especially when we're dealing with private companies, or, like, who are your investors? Sometimes we have silent investors, or we have customers that don't want to be mentioned. So there are unique and creative ways around those different questions. But right now, just as far as drawing limits, that's where we draw a lot of limits. So make sure you know where your limits are. Make sure you get the questions in advance if you can, and prepare. That's number one, to stay aligned when you're speaking to the public. Number two, be as honest as possible. So you don't have to lie, and no comment isn't a lie. It's just complete omission, right? So you're not talking about things you're not comfortable with, but when you are speaking, be honest and transparent, because if when things come out of your mouth, they are honest, then people will trust you more. So you're creating credibility and authenticity and the fun buzzwords. You want to create some kind of validation that when you do speak, you speak the kind of credibility you want to have. Number three, keep private things private. So make sure when you're talking to any kind of media that you're not talking about things that shouldn't be spoken about. I try to kind of draw a line between my personal and private life, and there's a certain amount of things I will say about my personal life when it comes to speaking with media or writing or speaking on this podcast. And then you have to know where you draw the line there too. So that's kind of like the same thing when messaging. How far will you go to expose your personal life, and what are you willing to put out there? And it doesn't matter that, maybe on social media you post about your social life. I mean, that's something that you need to investigate and evaluate as well, is like, what are you posting on social media? If you're not saying it on an interview, but then you post something strange or that's not consistent on your Instagram, your personal Instagram, like, what is that going to say about you? So there's a lot of things to factor out. But when you're speaking to the media, I would say keep your private things private, if unless you're talking about your private life. If you're talking about business, keep it business and kind of keep that focus. The next thing, number four, stay consistent. So having consistency is very important. Make sure that, whether it's on LinkedIn, a webinar, a podcast, an event, a trade show, or you're writing a blog, or you're on Instagram, like I just mentioned, or you're on Facebook, that whatever you're saying is consistent and in line with your personality. I think that's very important. People need to know if you stand strong on your beliefs. People want to know that you're not somebody who says one thing one day and says something else the next day. They need to know your personality, because I think that also provides a really great form of context when it comes to understanding the kind of person you are in business and in life. So a lot of times we hear some of these celebrities and we hear politicians and things like that waffle on their views. And that's where I think the questions start coming into play. If you have a consistent personality throughout, whether that means at some point you say no comment, they know how far you're willing to go. They, meaning the media or the public, know how far you're willing to go. They know kind of where you stand, and it gives them a really good, consistent perception of the type of person you are. So stay consistent. And I say that in every kind of messaging conversation, right? We talked about branding the other day. So, staying consistent, it's like the same thing as building your personal brand. And last but not least, don't say anything you haven't planned or feel uncomfortable with. There is no problem with saying no comment. And as a PR person, I champion this. You can say no comment, or I don't know the answer, or I'll get back to you. We are humans. We're not robots. We're not computers. So make sure that you can feel comfortable with saying no comment. You don't have to be forced into saying something that you don't want to say, or you don't want to comment on, or you don't want to talk about that. Or you could even say, I prefer not to talk about that. A fun pastime of mine is watching awkward celebrity interviews where like the celebrities get upset at the person who's asking the question. And you'll see a lot of times if they ask a offbeat question, they're like, what are you talking about? Why are you even asking this question? And I think that's, obviously that's an extreme. And I've seen a lot of funny ones. You can look them up on YouTube. But and there's extreme cases of like weird, very weird questions people ask. But there is nothing wrong with not answering those questions. And I don't think, in a regular business setting, if you're not a celebrity or a high profile executive and, politician or celeb or entertainment or sports star or whatever, they're probably not going to ask you some crazy offbeat question. But there are sometimes those questions that pop up and someone will ask you something. If you're not comfortable answering it, just say, I'm not comfortable answering this, or no comment. Those are the few things that you could say. Or you can even say, like, if it's not relevant, I don't feel like this is a relevant question to this interview. There's nothing wrong in calling people out. So I think that's a really important point, to stand on your ground and make sure that you haven't said anything that you haven't planned for, because that's when people become inconsistent. So I hope this was helpful. That was actually 5 ways to stay aligned when you're speaking to the public. And there's a lot more on this topic where we can, kind of wax a little bit more. But language is incredibly important. The words that come out of your mouth are incredibly important. I think it's important to keep it very simple and focused and consistent. And I hope that this is helpful when you're preparing for your next interview, your next meeting. I mean, this kind of plays out in so many different scenarios of life. So the 5 ways that we've talked about today, just to recap, stay aligned with when you're speaking to the public, is number 1, prepare your messaging beforehand. Number 2, be as honest and authentic as possible and transparent. Keep private things private. Number 3. Number 4, stay consistent. And number 5, don't say anything you have not planned or feel uncomfortable with. So just, take a beat and a lesson from some of these celebrities that are talking right now and what's going on Twitter. I mean, one of the biggest things that we've been talking about is, Kanye West and his loss of the Adidas deal. And you could look that up if you don't know about it, but it's like incredibly important how you deal with the media and how you deal with other people, because it could really heavily impact your life. And you're not under any obligation, especially if you're not a high profile celebrity, to comment on anything that you don't feel comfortable with. So I hope this is helpful. We did another episode a while back on the power of language, and I will try to get that into the show notes so that you can go back. But this lovely woman that I interviewed, I think last year, she wrote a book around it. And so if we could find that episode number, I will stick it into the show notes, and you can hear about her study on the power of language and how it impacts just the way you do business. And I kind of encourage you to also just take a look at that, and kind of investigate the power of language and how the words that you use can really impact your style, your influence, and your results. So have a great week, everybody. And I look forward to talking to you again next time.